If you started listing the most well-known pieces of Mario music, I doubt it would take long to land on the original Super Mario Bros. Underwater theme. It's classy, memorable, fun, and it's a really clever development of just one or two musical ideas. The first idea, and the easiest to notice, is the time signature. The piece is written in 3/4 time, played at a quick tempo, and the first beat of each measure is emphasized by both the lowest bass note of the bar and, in most cases, a strong held melody note. This relegates beats 2 and 3 of each measure to the thankless work of being the weak beats, and it's this rhythmic emphasis that gives the music a waltz feel. The legendary composer of the Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack, Koji Kondo, told Wired in an interview from 2007 that when working on the game, the underwater theme was the first piece of music he came up with. "It's easiest to imagine the kind of music you want for underwater," Kondo said, describing how quickly the piece came to him before going on to explain how the game's overworld theme caused him the most trouble and took the most rewrites to get right. It's kind of a funny thing to say, that it's easier to imagine what kind of music you'd want for underwater levels, but when you hear this waltz feel applied to a cheerful underwater setting, it does just feel right. I can see why it came together so quickly, especially knowing Kondo's approach to composition. When detailing how difficult nailing down the overworld theme was for him, Kondo emphasized how important it is to him that the rhythm of the music matches the rhythm of the gameplay, and that the music becomes part of the game rather than just a decorative layer placed on top of an otherwise finished product. If you play through one of these water levels, you can feel the very specific rhythm of how Mario controls. Tapping the jump button sends our athletic plumber shooting up toward the surface, and then he slowly floats back down toward the bottom of the screen. The time it takes to fall back down to your original position is much longer than the time it took to shoot up to the height of your jump, or stroke, or paddle, or whatever, and this motion is mirrored perfectly by the rhythmic feel of the waltz, with its strong beat 1 followed by weak beats 2 and 3. The music perfectly matches the movement that you're feeling as the game reacts to your inputs as a player, and this rhythmic feel has been carried forward into just about every underwater level in the 2D Mario games. The other musical idea that the piece plays with is, in technical terminology, the chromatic neighbor embellishment. There are lots of different ways to embellish a note, or decorate it with other notes that add a specific color or sense of motion to the melody but don't feel as important as the main note being embellished. Neighbor motion is what we call when a note moves to one of the notes on either side of it and then comes back to where it started. Chromatic neighbor motion is the version of this embellishment where, instead of dipping to the neighboring note in the scale or key, you dip down a semitone from your main note even if it takes you outside of the key of the piece. As I'm sure you can already hear in your head, the main melody from the underwater theme does this exact motion in a very clear way. We start on an E, the third of our home chord of C major, and then the next bar sees the melody dip down a half step to D sharp, even though this takes us out of the key of C. Following this up with a move back to the E where we started completes the chromatic neighbor motion. This chromatic note isn't dissonant per se because it resolves so cleanly, but it does lend a very specific kind of color to the melody. Actually, most, if not all, of the Super Mario Bros. Soundtracks make use of these kinds of chromatic embellishments of cheerful major key melodies as part of their musical identity, so it's a big part of the sound of Mario music in general. It's not just the melody that takes on this chromatic neighbor idea, though. All of the voices follow the same pattern, with the harmonizing G middle voice dipping down to an F sharp and back, and the C bass note dipping down to a B note and back. This makes the downbeat of each measure spell out a simple C major to B major to C major movement. But the bass line establishing the 3/4 waltz rhythm continues its pattern through this move, keeping the middle G note on beat 2 rather than dropping it down a half step to F sharp. This gives us this awkward situation where we have a B major triad and then also a G in the bass. Clearly, this was not arrived at by thinking of the chords built from the bottom up, but just by treating each note in each voice as an individual line that plays with this chromatic neighbor motion idea. Once we have these two main ideas in play, the rest of the piece kind of almost writes itself. The first melody note is the third of our home chord, with the fifth of the chord playing a sixth below it. This is a practical choice. You want the bass playing the root of the chord, so the remaining two voices allowed by the hardware should be spelling out the third and the fifth of the chord if we want to hear the full C major sound in all of its white key glory. You could also put the fifth on top and have the third below, but then you'd get an interval of a third between the two voices rather than a sixth. And Kondo has stated in interviews how he preferred to use spread-voiced chords like this, with a lot of space between each note, to make the limited number of notes allowed by the hardware sound fuller than they really are. So if you're using 3-note spread-voiced chords with your root on the bottom, you're pretty much going to have the third on top. Then we have the chromatic neighbor idea, which we just detailed, with the phrase closing off with a scalar run up to the third to repeat the same idea. We get just a touch more decoration on the repetition, with the chromatic neighbor note below our E jumping to the F note above and then resolving back down to that E. Sandwiching both upper and lower neighbors between our two main notes makes this technically a double neighbor embellishment, just giving us a little more of the same neighbor note idea. Our original melodic idea expressed a C major sound in the key of C major, and now we're going to get a version of it that expresses a G major sound, which is the dominant of the key. The melody starts a step lower than before, on a D, still harmonized a sixth below by this F note in the middle, over the bass outlining a G major triad to create a G7 chord altogether. This chromatically dips down to F sharp 7 and back up, and then a scalar run brings us back to the same dominant version figure. Notice the chromatic passing note used in the run to make it fit rhythmically into the same number of notes, but land a whole step lower than we saw this run do on the first phrase. This last phrase doesn't use a chromatic neighbor, but jumps down to the fifth of the key instead, using the extra momentum provided by a big leap from the fifth to make this final 4-3 resolution back to our tonic C major feel more final. If we kept the chromatic neighbor tone movement for this very last phrase too, you could feel that this last resolution would be a lot less satisfying. Using the tonic and dominant forms of the same melodic idea is a compositional device used for hundreds of years, and could almost be seen as a default approach to stretching out a melody. You can't deny that it works though, especially with this kind of straightforward, cheerful atmosphere. The ending portion of the tune is really interesting, taking the idea of these chromatic passing notes that we've seen used in different runs throughout the piece and fleshing them out into their own little section. I'm going to play the whole ending, talk about it, and then play it again for you so you can listen for what I talked about. The melody stays static on this G note on top, and the lack of melodic motion serves to highlight the motion of the voices beneath it. The middle voice moves from the third of our C major chord down to the second of the key, and then chromatically down to the flat second, this D flat. The bass line arpeggiates these big spread open voicings of a C major chord moving to a G over B chord to a B flat minor 6 chord, mirroring both the descent of the counterline and the static G note of the melody. After an upper neighbor embellishment of this G note up to an A and back, the melody repeats down a step from where we started, just like how we developed our original melodic idea. This time we start on an F with the middle voice starting once again a third below, and this time descends chromatically from this D note to a C note as the bass line outlines a D minor to D flat augmented to F over C chord progression to accommodate this movement. This leads into a G7 chord harmonizing another upper neighbor embellishment of our note before the last phrase comes in. We start by resolving to a C chord, but realizing we're on the 9th bar of the phrase, Kondo extends this resolution with another 5/1 cadence to make this section an only mildly weird 12 bars in length instead. I love the way this G7 chord moves to a G13 voicing without the G bass note, just the 7th, the 3rd, and the 13th of the chord in this dissonant stack that gives way to a classic resolution to our C major tonic for the last bar. Okay, it's a little facetious to try and say there was no creative decision-making besides the time signature and the chromatic neighbor embellishment, but looking at how naturally each idea stems from those main initial figures makes me think that this piece probably came out very smoothly. I wouldn't be surprised if it felt to Koji Kondo like the tune was writing itself. There can be no argument about the effectiveness of this piece at capturing the movement of the Super Mario water levels and setting a gorgeous, relaxing tone that works perfectly with the feeling of floating along through an underwater world. The actual levels themselves might not be so relaxing to play, but the music absolutely captures the right vibe, as evidenced by the fact that all 2D Mario water music from this point on follows basically the same principles to get to the exact same feeling. Check out my Patreon if you want to support what I do on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.